The salt stung my lungs like a curse when I first stepped onto the Gulf Wraith, each breath carrying the weight of decisions that had brought me here. October in Apalachicola meant the air hung thick with brine and regret, and I breathed both deep, tasting the metallic edge of fear that had followed me down from Miami. The trawler's barnacle-crusted hull creaked like a coffin settling into earth, and somewhere in the wheelhouse the radio spat static like an angry ghost refusing to rest. I'd been running for 3 weeks since everything went to hell. The smuggling operation I'd built over 2 years, careful routes through the Keys, trusted contacts in Nassau, a network that moved everything from Cuban cigars to Venezuelan pharmaceuticals, crumbled in a single night when I made the call that saved my skin and damned my crew. The Coast Guard had been closing in, their intel too precise, their timing too perfect. Someone was feeding them information, and I made sure it wasn't me who went down for it. Self-preservation had always been my specialty, learned in foster homes where you ate or went hungry, perfected in juvenile detention where weakness meant blood on concrete. But watching Carlos and Miguel get hauled away in cuffs while I slipped out the back of that Coconut Grove bar, that guilt gnawed at me like rust eating through metal, leaving holes I couldn't patch. The Gulf was supposed to be my out, a place to disappear until the heat died down. I didn't expect it to pull me under in ways I'd never imagined. Vera Santos found me at Mira's bait shop on a Tuesday morning when the fog hung low enough to taste. I was nursing coffee that burned like diesel fuel and staring at job postings that might as well have been written in dead languages: commercial fishing, deckhand, boat maintenance. Honest work for someone who'd spent the last decade living in the gray spaces between legal and profitable. She was 60-something, with sea-weathered hands that looked capable of strangling a shark and eyes sharp as hooks. Her gray hair was pulled back severe, salt-stained and practical, and she wore the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen things most people wouldn't believe. When she moved, it was with the careful economy of someone who'd spent decades working in tight spaces where a wrong step could mean the difference between coming home and feeding the fish. "You the one looking for boat work?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from me. Her voice carried the weight of decades spent yelling over engine noise and storms, rough as barnacles but not unkind. "Depends what kind of work." I'd learned to be careful about commitments, especially from strangers who appeared like answers to prayers I hadn't prayed. Honest work, fishing, maintenance, keeping the peace. She studied me like she was reading tide charts, taking in the nervous energy I couldn't quite hide, the way my eyes tracked the door, the careful distance I kept between myself and the other customers. "You remind me of my boy, Mateo. He had that same look, like he was carrying something heavy." I didn't ask what happened to Mateo. In places like this, surrounded by memorial plaques for fishermen who didn't come home and Coast Guard photos of successful rescues, that question usually led somewhere dark. But the way her voice caught on his name told me enough. "Gulf Wraith's been my boat since 1984, Vera continued, pulling a thermos from her canvas bag and pouring coffee that steamed like fog. "She's old, but she's got good bones. 73-foot shrimper, converted for fishing charters and fuel stops. Needs someone who can handle the night shifts, deal with all kinds of customers. Fishermen heading out before dawn, Coast Guard boys doing their rounds, tourists who don't know a cleat from a capstan." The pay was decent, better than I'd expected for legitimate work. $300 a week plus tips, cash every Friday, no questions about references or background checks. Room and board included. A small cabin below decks that she assured me was clean and private. It was exactly what I needed. Invisible work that paid enough to send money to Nora for Lily's expenses, far enough from Miami to avoid awkward questions. "There are rules," Vera said, reaching into her bag again and pulling out a salt-stained piece of paper, the ink faded but still legible in her precise handwriting. 6 of them. Follow these exactly. No shortcuts, no exceptions, no interpretations. This coast's older than most people realize. Seminole fishing grounds going back centuries, pirate wrecks from the 1700s, Spanish treasure fleets that never made it home. The Gulf remembers everything, and it doesn't forgive carelessness. I read the first rule. Always acknowledge the rider's light. Never hide. "What's the rider?" I asked. But Vera was already standing, shouldering her bag with the practiced motion of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "You'll know when you see it," she said. "Just remember, you don't hide. You let it see you clearly, so it passes by. The dead don't like to be ignored, but they respect those who show proper courtesy." The first week passed quietly, almost peacefully. I learned the Gulf Wraith's rhythms, the way her diesel engine coughed to life each morning like an old man clearing his throat, how the nets needed constant mending because the Gulf's currents carried debris that cut through nylon like razors, where to stack the fuel cans so they wouldn't shift in rough seas and turn the deck into a skating rink of spilled gasoline. The boat was a 1970s relic, all rusted deck plates and sun-bleached wood, but Vera maintained her like a shrine. Every morning she'd walk the perimeter, checking lines and testing equipment with the methodical precision of a ritual. The wheelhouse was cramped but organized, charts rolled and secured, radio equipment that looked military surplus but worked better than anything I'd seen on newer boats. During the day, we served the fishing community that worked these waters. Commercial fishermen heading out to the deeper channels would stop for fuel and bait, their boats heavy with ice and hope. The Coast Guard made regular visits, their young officers polite but watchful, asking casual questions about boat traffic and unusual sightings that I answered with the careful neutrality of someone with nothing to hide. Tourists came too, retirees in spotless boats who bought overpriced snacks and asked about the best fishing spots, their enthusiasm infectious despite their obvious inexperience. Vera treated them all the same. Fair prices, good advice, and the kind of maritime courtesy that had kept her in business for 4 decades. But at night, the Gulf changed. Fog rolled in thick as grief, muffling sounds and making distant lights dance like will-o-wisps. The radio picked up strange signals, snatches of Spanish from fishing boats that weren't on any chart, children singing nursery rhymes in languages I didn't recognize, sometimes what sounded like Seminole chanting carried on winds that came from no particular direction. "Old waters hold old voices," Vera told me during one of these evening shifts, her hands steady on a net she was mending by lamplight. "The Seminoles fished these waters for 1,000 years before Europeans showed up. Spanish treasure fleets used to shelter in these bays during hurricane season. Pirates careened their ships on these beaches. The dead don't always understand they've stopped breathing, and the Gulf doesn't forget." I learned to ignore the radio's strange moods, to focus on the work that kept my hands busy and my mind off the weight of the past. But sometimes, in the quiet hours after midnight, when only the running lights marked our presence on the dark water, I caught myself listening for something I couldn't name. The second week brought the light, and with it, my first real lesson in the rules that governed life on the Gulf Wraith. It was 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday when I first saw it. A single point of white light moving across the water about a quarter-mile out, steady and purposeful in a way that made my smuggler's instincts twitch. Too steady to be a boat riding the evening swells, too bright to be a standard fishing light, and moving at a speed that suggested serious power behind it. I was cleaning the coffee station in the wheelhouse, scrubbing salt stains from the metal counter, and trying not to think about the call I'd need to make to Nora tomorrow. Another explanation for why the money would be late, another promise that things were getting better. The radio was cycling through weather reports and fishing advisories, background noise I'd learned to filter out. Then Vera appeared in the doorway like she'd materialized from the fog itself, moving faster than I'd seen since she hired me. Her hands flew to the control panel, flipping on the deck lights and pushing open the wheelhouse door in one fluid motion. Cool air rushed in, carrying the smell of salt and something else, something old and wet, like the inside of a cave that had never seen sunlight. "Come on," she said, not looking back as she stepped onto the deck. I followed her into the night air, leaving the relative warmth and safety of the wheelhouse for the open deck, where the fog swirled around us like living things. The light had stopped moving and seemed to be watching us, a single point of heat and illumination that made the October air shimmer like summer pavement. "You don't hide," Vera said, her voice steady despite the strangeness of the moment. "Rule number 1, let it see you clearly so it knows you're not what it's looking for." We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 minutes, the light holding position while fog gathered around it like a living thing drawn to warmth. I could feel heat radiating from it despite the distance, making my skin prickle with sweat and something deeper, a primal awareness that I was in the presence of something that didn't belong to the world I understood. Then, without warning, it moved again. The light slid north along the coast, following the shoreline with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. It disappeared into the deeper waters where the commercial fishing boats worked their nets, leaving behind only the familiar darkness and the sound of waves against the hull. 20 minutes later, a tourist boat limped into our dock. Their 40-foot bayliner should have been running smooth on a calm night like this, but she was barely making headway, her engine coughing like a sick dog. The captain, a sunburned retiree from Alabama named Pete, tied off with hands that shook badly enough that I had to help him secure the lines. "Damnedest thing," he kept muttering as Vera and I helped him and his wife aboard. "Radio just went dead. GPS started spinning like a compass near a magnet. Depth finder showing readings that can't be right. Engine temperature spiked, then dropped to nothing. Never seen anything like it in 30 years of boating." His wife, Martha, clutched a life jacket like a talisman and kept glancing at the water like she expected something to surface. "There was a light," she said quietly, while Pete was below checking their engine. "Bright as the sun, but cold. Made the air feel thick, like breathing underwater." Vera waived their docking fee and sold them fresh batteries at cost, checking their radio and GPS with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that mechanical failure on the water could be the difference between a story to tell at the marina and a Coast Guard search. Everything worked perfectly once they'd been at our dock for an hour, their instruments reading normal, their engine purring like new. After they left, putting slowly toward the marina with their running lights steady and bright, Vera poured coffee from her thermos and gestured for me to sit at the small table in the wheelhouse. The radio crackled to life, playing Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald despite being tuned to a weather station, the haunting melody drifting across the water like a prayer for the lost. "That was the drowned rider," Vera said, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like she was drawing warmth from it. "His name was Elias Cole, died in 1987 when his boat went down during a Coast Guard chase. He was a smuggler, like you used to be. Fast boat, good routes, thought he was smarter than the law. The coffee tasted like ash, but I kept drinking it anyway. What happened to him? The guard cornered him near the barrier islands during a storm. He was running drugs from Mexico, had a reputation for being too clever by half. When they boxed him in, he chose the water over prison, pushed his engines past redline and tried to outrun them through the shallows." Vera's eyes went distant, looking past me toward the dark water. "Boat broke apart on the reef. They found pieces washing up for weeks, but never found him. And now he searches these waters for the boats that chased him. The light you saw, that's his boat, still trying to outrun what caught him. The dead don't always understand they've stopped breathing, especially the ones who died angry." She fixed me with that hook-sharp stare that seemed to see through whatever mask I was wearing. "Cole searches for Coast Guard cutters, enforcement boats, anything that reminds him of what killed him. Sometimes he decides civilian boats are threats too, especially ones with equipment that looks official." I thought about the tourist boat's failed instruments, the way their engine had struggled like something was draining its power. And acknowledging him keeps him from deciding your Coast Guard, or competition, or just in his way. Vera's fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm that matched the waves against the hull. "The rules aren't suggestions, Caleb. Their survival instructions written in other people's blood. This coast has been taking lives for centuries, and the only reason we're still here is because people before us learned how to show proper respect. I looked down at the rule sheet, now damp with salt spray and handling. 5 more rules waited below the first, their implications making my stomach clench with the realization that my new job was more complicated than I'd bargained for. Outside, a gull cried once, the sound echoing across the fog-shrouded gulf like a scream from the throat of something that had seen too much. The radio static shifted and changed, and for just a moment, I swore I heard the distant rumble of engines that would never reach shore, pushing past Redline in a race that had been over for 38 years. The Gulf Wraith rocked gently in her slip, and I realized I wasn't just working on this boat. I was becoming part of whatever ancient contract kept these waters from claiming everyone who dared to cross them. The rules weren't just guidelines for employment. They were the terms of survival in a place where the past refused to stay buried. By the 3rd week, I'd fallen into the Gulf Wraith's rhythm like a man learning to breathe underwater. The morning routine started before dawn. Check fuel pumps, test radio equipment, brew coffee that burned like diesel. The work wasn't complicated, but it demanded the kind of attention that kept my mind from wandering to places better left alone, like the crew I'd betrayed in Miami, or the money I still owed Nora for Lily's school expenses that kept accumulating no matter how many promises I made. The oil-slick air hung heavy around the boat, thick with salt and diesel fumes that burned my throat like regret made manifest. Every breath tasted of decisions I couldn't take back, of choices that had led me from the gleaming towers of Miami's smuggling operations to this weathered dock in the Florida Panhandle. But there was something honest about the work, something clean in the simple routine of maintenance and service that I hadn't felt in years of moving contraband through international waters. Vera had me learning net mending, sitting on deck in the late afternoon sun with my fingers working through nylon mesh while she showed me how to spot the subtle signs of wear that could cost a fisherman his livelihood. Her weathered hands moved through the repairs with practiced ease, decades of muscle memory guiding every knot and splice. The work was meditative in its way, requiring focus that pushed away the constant background noise of guilt and worry that had followed me from Miami like a persistent shadow. "The Gulf doesn't give second chances," she'd say, her voice carrying the weight of 4 decades on these waters. "Equipment fails out there. You're swimming with things that don't care about your mortgage payment or your kid's birthday party. The sea takes what it wants, when it wants it, and all you can do is show proper respect." The fishermen who stopped by treated me with the cautious courtesy reserved for newcomers who might not last the season. They'd nod politely, pay for fuel and bait with crumpled bills that smelled of salt and honest work. Ask careful questions about weather patterns and Coast Guard schedules that I answered with the neutral professionalism I'd learned in less legal enterprises. Some had been working these waters since before I was born, their boats extensions of themselves, their knowledge earned through storms and near misses that would have sent lesser men looking for desk jobs in Tallahassee. The older captains had a way of looking at you that suggested they could read your history in the set of your shoulders, the way you handled lines, whether you instinctively checked escape routes when you entered a new space. They didn't ask direct questions about my background, but I could feel them cataloging details, forming opinions about whether I'd stick around when the work got hard or the weather turned dangerous. Coast Guard boys were friendlier, young officers buying overpriced coffee and asking casual questions about boat traffic that I answered with careful neutrality. They never pushed, never made me feel like they suspected anything about my past, but I could feel them watching the way good cops always did. Professional curiosity, not suspicion, but the kind of attention that kept me honest in my answers and careful in my movements around federal law enforcement. During the daylight hours, the Gulf felt almost normal. Tourists in spotless boats would stop for snacks and directions, their enthusiasm infectious despite their obvious inexperience. They'd ask about the best fishing spots, the safest routes to the barrier islands, whether the weather was going to hold through the weekend. Commercial fishermen would fuel up before heading to deeper waters, their holds packed with ice and hope, Their conversations focused on practical concerns like fuel prices and fish populations that had nothing to do with supernatural rules or ghostly lights. But at night, the Gulf changed into something older and stranger, something that belonged to a different world than the one governed by Coast Guard regulations and maritime law. Fog rolled in thick as grief, muffling sounds and making distant lights dance like spirits seeking rest. The radio picked up signals that shouldn't exist, snatches of Spanish from boats that weren't on any chart, children singing nursery rhymes in languages I didn't recognize, sometimes what sounded like Seminole chanting carried on winds that came from no particular direction and tasted of salt and sorrow. Old waters hold old voices, Vera told me during one of these evening shifts, her hand steady on a net she was mending by lamplight. This coast's been taking lives for centuries. Seminole fishing parties, Spanish treasure fleets, pirate crews, commercial fishermen, smugglers like you used to be. The dead don't always understand they've stopped breathing, and the Gulf doesn't forget the debts it's owed. The man with silver coins appeared Thursday night at 10:30 p.m., emerging from the fog like he'd been walking on water for longer than should be possible. I was cleaning the fuel station, scrubbing salt stains from the metal counter and trying not to think about the call I'd need to make to Nora tomorrow. Another explanation for why the money would be late. Another promise that things were getting better. Another lie about the legitimate work I was supposedly doing in this forgotten corner of Florida. The radio was cycling through weather reports and fishing advisories, background noise I'd learned to filter out during my weeks aboard the Gulf Wraith. He was mid-40s, wearing a weathered yellow slicker that looked like it had seen decades of Gulf storms and salt spray. His face was hard to focus on directly, the kind of features that seemed to shift when you weren't looking right at them, like heat distortion over summer pavement or mirages on distant water. He moved with the careful balance of someone accustomed to shifting decks, but there was no boat tied at our pier, no engine sound carrying across the water to announce his arrival from the darkness beyond our lights. "Need fuel," he said, his voice carrying the flat accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Spanish first, learned English as a necessity for commerce rather than comfort. 10 gallons, regular. I filled his canteen, military surplus, worn smooth by handling and years of use, and watched him count out payment with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this transaction many times before. 3 silver coins, tarnished and heavy, each bearing the profile of some long-dead king I didn't recognize. Spanish colonial maybe, or Confederate, the kind of currency that belonged in museums rather than modern maritime commerce. They felt cold against my palm when he dropped them into my hand, colder than the October night air, and they seemed to whisper when they touched my skin. Not words exactly, but the kind of sound that made you want to check over your shoulder for things that shouldn't be there. The weight was wrong too, heavier than silver should be, as if they were made of something denser and more permanent than ordinary metal. "That'll cover it," he said, tipping his cap with old-world courtesy that belonged to a different century, a different understanding of how business should be conducted between strangers on dark water. I pocketed the coins without thinking, my attention caught by movement in the fog behind him. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw the outline of a boat, something sleek and fast, with lines that suggested it had been built for speed rather than comfort or cargo capacity. But when I looked directly, there was nothing but gray mist and dark water rolling against our dock with the endless patience of the sea. "You're not from around here," I said, but when I looked back, he was gone. His canteen had vanished too, along with the fuel I'd dispensed. The pump showed 0 gallons transferred, as if the transaction had never happened, as if I'd imagined the entire encounter. Only the coins remained, burning cold in my pocket like stolen ice, their weight somehow greater than when I'd first held them. My fingers tingled where I'd touched them, and somewhere in the distance, I heard faint children's laughter carried on wind that tasted of brine and sorrow. That's when Vera appeared in the wheelhouse doorway, moving faster than I'd seen since she hired me, her sea-weathered face tight with controlled alarm. "He's not trouble," she said, her eyes scanning the empty pier with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to read danger in the set of waves and the color of clouds. "Just passing through." Her expression went granite hard when she saw my face, the way my hand kept moving toward my pocket, where the coins waited like a guilty secret. "What did you take from him?" I pulled the coins from my pocket, their weight somehow greater than physics should allow. Vera took one look and cursed in Spanish, words that seemed to make the radio static spike with interference sharp enough to hurt my ears. "Rule number 2, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Never accept payment in silver coins. Dead sailors don't need change, and they don't like being turned away empty-handed." She led me to the wheelhouse, opened a panel beneath the helm I hadn't noticed before, and pulled out a wooden box blackened with age and salt air. Inside, dozens of similar coins lay nestled in felt, their surfaces dark with tarnish but bearing the same impossible weight. "Spanish pieces of 8, Confederate $half that were never minted," Vera said, adding my 3 coins to the collection. "Every coin tells a story of someone who died with business unfinished. Accept payment from a ghost, and you become part of their unfinished business." The next morning brought Mira Torres to our dock, her beat-up fishing boat loaded with supplies that suggested she took the supernatural side of Gulf Coast commerce more seriously than most people took their day jobs. She was 50-something, with silver-streaked hair and hands that moved like she was conducting invisible music when she talked. "Vera," she called, securing her boat with practiced efficiency. "The water's been acting strange, ripples stopping abruptly, wakes that don't match the boats making them." She climbed aboard with easy familiarity, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with glass and metal. Protective charms, I realized, watching her unpack bundles of dried seaweed braided with salt crystals. That evening, Tom arrived shaken, hearing his mother's voice calling from 20 feet down. Vera gave him a seaweed charm. "Rule number 4, she told me. Help the living ward off the dead." The radio crackled, playing La Llorona, a haunting Spanish melody about loss and water. "If she plays 3 times in one night," Vera said, "we secure the boat and wait for dawn." The song faded, then began again. "That's 2, she said quietly. The 4th week brought changes I could feel in my bones before I could see them with my eyes. The Gulf's rhythm had shifted, subtle at first. Tides running higher than the weather predicted, fog that moved against the wind, radio static that formed patterns too regular to be random. Even the coffee burned like diesel tasted different, carrying an edge of brine that made my throat close up like I was breathing underwater. Vera noticed my unease during the morning net mending. I kept dropping stitches, my fingers clumsy with a tension I couldn't name. The work that had become meditative now felt like trying to repair something that was already broken beyond fixing. "The blood moon's coming," she said without looking up from her section of net. 3 nights from now. You can feel it building, can't you? Like pressure before a storm, but deeper. Older. She was right. The air itself felt thicker, charged with the kind of electricity that made your skin crawl and your teeth ache. I'd felt something similar before hurricanes in Miami, that sense of nature gathering itself for violence. But this was different. Less weather than awakening, as if something vast had opened one eye beneath the waves. "What happens during a blood moon?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be something I didn't want to hear. "The barrier's thin. Things that usually stay buried come up for air." Vera tied off a section with swift, practiced movements. "That's when the rules matter most. Break them then, and the consequences don't fade with daylight." That afternoon, she led me to a part of the Gulf Wraith I hadn't seen before. A cabin tucked behind the wheelhouse, accessible only through a hatch that looked like it belonged to the original ship's structure. The space was cramped, lined with mirrors that reflected our movements in fragments and angles that hurt to look at directly. "Rule number 5, Vera said, positioning herself so I could see both her reflection and the deck behind us through the open hatch. "Never trust mirrors after midnight. They show what's coming or what's gone, not always what's there." She pointed to one of the mirrors, and I saw something that made my smuggler's instincts scream warnings I'd learned to trust. In the reflection, a shadow stood on the deck where no one should be, tall, wearing what looked like deck gear from a different era. But when I turned to look directly at the deck, there was nothing but afternoon sunlight and coiled rope. "See him?" Vera asked. "That's Tommy Reeves, worked this boat in '92, got tangled in the nets during a storm, went overboard. When you see crew in mirrors that aren't on deck, it means they're trying to tell you something. Usually that death's coming for someone else." My skin crawled as I watched the shadow figure point toward the water, its movements urgent despite the silence. Why doesn't he just appear like the others? Some die too suddenly to learn the rules. They get caught between what was and what is, only able to reach through reflections. Vera adjusted one of the mirrors, and the figure became clearer. Tommy's been warning us about rough weather for 30 years. Never wrong. That evening brought Jasper Cole to our dock, his boat riding so low in the water I thought he might be taking on bilge. But when he tied off, I realized the weight was fear. It sat on him like lead ballast, dragging down his shoulders and making his normally steady hands shake as he secured the lines. "Vera," he called, his voice carrying the strain of a man who'd seen something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "Need to talk. It's about the ripples." Jasper was a third-generation fisherman, one of the regulars who'd been working these waters since before I was born. If something had him spooked, it was worth paying attention to. He climbed aboard with the careful movements of someone whose confidence had been shaken. "7 ripples," he said without preamble. Perfect line, each one about the size of a coffee can, pointing straight out toward the deep Gulf. "Started yesterday evening. Been there every time I check. My grandfather told stories about patterns like that." Vera's expression went stone hard. "Show me exactly where." Jasper led us to the bow and pointed toward a section of water about a quarter-mile out. At first I saw nothing unusual, just the normal chop of afternoon waves. Then the light shifted, and I caught sight of them, 7 circular disturbances in the water, evenly spaced and perfectly aligned, as if something beneath the surface was pressing upward with methodical precision. "Rule number 6, Vera said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. 7 ripples in a line means secure the boat. It's the Tide Eater's calling card, marking territory for the Blood Moon hunt." "What's the Tide Eater?" I asked, though the name alone was enough to make my mouth go dry. "Hunger given form. It feeds during blood moons, takes whatever's close to the ripples." Vera handed Jasper one of Mira's charms, this one larger than the others, woven with what looked like fragments of mirror along with the usual seaweed and salt crystals. "Sprinkle salt around your boat, Jasper. Don't anchor anywhere near those ripples, and if you see them move closer to shore, you call everyone you know." The next morning brought Mira Torres back to our dock, but this time she wasn't carrying supplies. She was carrying news that made Vera's weather-beaten face go pale, despite 4 decades of Gulf Coast horrors. "Dreams," Mira said, securing her boat with movements that suggested she'd been up all night. "Half the fishing community's having them. The ripples calling to people, promising easy catches, calm seas. Maria Santos saw her drowned brother standing in them, waving her closer. They conferred in rapid Spanish while I worked on maintenance tasks that suddenly felt pointless. The conversation was too fast for me to follow completely, but I caught enough to understand that whatever was coming wasn't limited to our boat. The entire coast was being tested, evaluated, marked for something that would happen when the moon turned red. "We need to distribute charms to everyone," Vera said finally, switching back to English. "Starting with the families closest to the water. Children are always the first targets." The mention of children made my chest tighten with thoughts of Lily in Tampa, safely distant from whatever ancient hunger was stirring in these waters. But the feeling also carried something else, a fierce protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity. These people had become something like family, and family was worth protecting, even when you'd betrayed your blood family in Miami. That night, alone in the mirror cabin while Vera handled the evening customers, I learned why rule number 5 mattered more than academic curiosity about the supernatural. The mirrors had been humming since sunset, a low frequency that seemed to vibrate in my bones rather than my ears. Fog pulsed beyond the windows like a living heart, and the radio downstairs kept cycling through stations that shouldn't exist. Children's songs in dead languages, weather reports for waters that weren't on any chart, sometimes what sounded like maritime emergencies from decades past. Just after midnight, the humming stopped. In the sudden silence, I saw him clearly, not Tommy Reeves this time, but someone else entirely. An older man wearing clothes that belonged to the 1890s, his face carrying the hard lines of someone who'd lived by violence and cunning. He stood in the mirror's reflection of the cabin, pointing urgently toward the water beyond the windows. Silas Ward, Mira's voice said behind me, though I hadn't heard her come aboard. Smuggler from the old days, ran guns and rum through these waters during the Spanish-American War. If he's showing himself, it means big trouble's coming. I turned to find her standing in the hatch, her eyes reflecting the mirror's strange light. How do you know who he is? Family stories. My great-grandmother was Seminole, worked with the spirits before the whites came and made everything complicated. She studied the figure in the mirror, who continued his urgent pointing. He warns of big trouble, the kind that changes everything. The radio crackled to life downstairs, and the familiar melody of La Llorona began to play. But this time it felt different. Not random interference, but deliberate summoning, as if something was using the weeping woman's song to test the boundaries between worlds. That's the second time tonight, Vera called from below. One more and we button up until dawn. Mira and I exchanged glances. The blood moon was still 2 nights away, but the supernatural pressure was building faster than anyone had expected. In the mirror, Silas Ward's pointing became more frantic, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard distant voices carried on the fog, children laughing, women weeping, men calling warnings in languages that predated European contact. The song faded, leaving behind silence that felt wrong in its completeness. Even the waves seemed muted, as if the Gulf itself was holding its breath. It's starting early, Mira whispered. The barriers are weakening faster than usual. Outside, the fog began to thicken, and somewhere in the distance, I heard what might have been a woman singing or something else entirely that had learned to mimic human voices. The 7 ripples were still there, holding their perfect formation, but now they seemed larger, more defined. The blood moon was coming, and with it, something that had been waiting in the deep waters for its chance to hunt. The blood moon rose like a wound in the sky, casting everything in shades of copper and old blood. I'd never seen anything like it. Not just red, but pulsing, as if something vast and hungry had opened its eye above the Gulf waters. The air itself felt different, thicker, charged with the kind of energy that made your teeth ache and your skin crawl with invisible electricity. Vera had anchored the Gulf Wraith early, pulling us into a sheltered cove where the water barely moved and the mangroves formed a natural barrier against whatever was coming. She'd been preparing since dawn, moving with the focused intensity of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly how high the stakes were. Tonight's different, she told me as we secured extra lines and checked the radio equipment one final time. Blood moons only come every few years, but when they do, the barriers between worlds get thin as tissue paper. Things that usually stay buried come up for air. She led me below deck to a storage area I'd never seen before, accessible only through a hatch hidden behind the engine compartment. The space was cramped and humid, with coral walls that looked like they'd grown rather than been built. Jars of preserved seaweed lined makeshift shelves, and dozens of photographs were tacked to every available surface, images of the Gulf during storms, during calm weather, during times when the water moved in ways that defied physics. The air smelled of brine and something older, something that reminded me of caves deep underwater where sunlight had never penetrated. Every breath tasted of salt and secrets, of knowledge that wasn't meant for people who lived above the waves. The Tide Eater takes those near ripples, Vera said, pointing to several photographs that showed water moving in perfect spirals, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. It feeds during blood moons, pulls souls down to whatever depth it calls home. The photos show what your eyes can't see, the feeding tendrils, the shadow tides that carry people away. I studied the images, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. In some, the water looked normal. In others, dark shapes moved beneath the surface, reaching upward with appendages that seemed to be made of liquid shadow. The worst ones showed people in boats, their faces serene and peaceful, completely unaware of what was rising toward them from below. "Why photos?" I asked, though part of me already understood the answer. Cameras don't lie the way eyes do. They see what's actually there, not what something wants you to see. She handed me an old Polaroid camera, its body worn smooth by decades of handling. "Keep this with you tonight. Trust what it shows you, not what your senses tell you." By evening, the community had gathered in our cramped below-decks refuge. Jasper Cole sat in one corner, methodically cleaning a fishing knife while his eyes stayed fixed on the photographs showing ripple patterns. Mira Torres had brought additional charms, more complex ones than I'd seen before, woven with materials that looked like they'd been collected from deep water and places where normal light couldn't reach. 17 people in the past 50 years, Vera said, reviewing a handwritten ledger by the light of battery-powered lanterns. All taken during blood moons, all near the 7 ripple formations. The Gulf remembers every one of them, and the Tide Eater uses their voices to lure others. The boat began to rock gently as the blood moon reached its zenith, and that's when the humming started. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate in my bones rather than my ears. The photographs on the walls began to flutter despite the absence of any wind, and in several of them, I could see dark shapes moving more actively than before, as if the blood moon's light had awakened something that normally slept. "It's starting," Mira whispered, clutching a charm made of salt crystals and what looked like fragments of very old glass. "Everyone stay below deck. No matter what you hear, don't go topside." The humming grew stronger, and with it came other sounds, scratching against the hull, as if something with very long fingers was testing the strength of our barriers. The radio crackled to life, cycling through static and fragments of voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, some of which might not have been human languages at all. Through the small porthole, I could see the water around us beginning to move in patterns that defied current and wind. 7 perfect circles formed in a line pointing toward the deeper gulf, each one pulsing with the same rhythm as the humming that filled our bones. In the photographs, feeding tendrils became visible, dark appendages reaching up from depths that had never been properly mapped. That's when I heard Lily's voice. "Caleb," she called, her voice carrying perfectly through the blood moon night, despite the fact that she was 300 miles away in Tampa. "Caleb, I'm drowning. Please help me." Every instinct I'd developed as a father, every protective impulse that had kept me sending money to Nora, despite my own desperate circumstances, screamed at me to respond. I was moving toward the ladder before conscious thought could stop me, driven by the kind of parental panic that overrides everything else. "Don't!" Vera said sharply, but I was already climbing, my hands shaking as I pushed open the hatch. The deck was bathed in blood-red moonlight, and there, standing at the bow, were Nora and Lily. My ex-wife looked exactly as she had the last time I'd seen her, wearing the blue dress she'd worn to our divorce proceedings. Lily looked like she'd grown since our last video call, but she was crying, reaching toward the water with small hands that trembled with fear. "Daddy," she sobbed, "I fell in the water and I can't swim anymore. The lady says you have to come get me." Behind them, barely visible in the strange light, stood a tall figure in an oil-slick coat. Its face was a smooth blank, featureless as a mannequin, but its presence radiated cold that made the October night feel like winter in the Arctic. The Tide Eater, I realized, the thing that fed during blood moons and used the voices of the lost to lure new prey. "Trust the camera, not your eyes," Vera called from below, and I remembered the Polaroid in my hands. I raised it and took a picture, the flash briefly illuminating the deck in harsh white light. When the image developed, it showed only the Tide Eater standing alone at the bow, its featureless face turned toward me with the patient hunger of something that had been waiting a very long time to feed. Nora and Lily were illusions, voices borrowed from people the Gulf had claimed, echoes of my own guilt and fear given form by something that understood exactly how to hurt me most effectively. "Offer a memory trade," Vera shouted from below. "Give it something it wants more than your life." The Tide Eater stepped closer, and I could feel its attention like ice water flooding my veins. Cold tore through my mind, searching for something valuable enough to satisfy its hunger. It wanted memories. Not just any memories, but the ones that mattered most. The ones that defined who I was and why I made the choices that had brought me here. I thought about Lily's real laugh, not the crying echo I'd just heard. I thought about the moment I decided to betray my crew in Miami, the weight of that choice and everything it had cost me. I thought about my first day on the Gulf Wraith, the way Vera had looked at me and seen something worth saving despite all evidence to the contrary. "My first day here," I said aloud, the words torn from my throat by cold that felt like drowning in reverse. The memory of how I came to work on this boat. Take it. The Tide Eater's featureless face tilted, considering the offer. Then cold flooded through my mind like water through a broken dam, tearing away images and sensations I'd carried for weeks. The conversation with Vera at Mira's bait shop, the first time I'd seen the Gulf Wraith, the moment I'd decided this job was my chance at redemption, all of it dissolved like sugar in rain. Lily's voice dissolved with it, along with the illusion of Nora and the overwhelming presence of the creature that had been using their images to lure me to my death. The Tide Eater retreated into shadows and mist, carrying my memory away to whatever depths it called home. Dawn broke gray and ordinary, the blood moon fading into memory as normal sunlight returned to the Gulf. But when Vera asked me how I'd ended up working on the Gulf Wraith, I couldn't remember. The weeks between leaving Miami and standing on this deck were gone, replaced by a gap that felt like missing teeth. I knew I was running from something, knew I had a daughter in Tampa who needed money I couldn't afford to send. But how I'd come to be here, how I'd learned the rules that governed survival on these waters, all of that belonged to the Tide Eater now, payment for a life that should have been forfeit. The Gulf lapped gently against our hull, innocent as baptismal water in the morning light. The weeks after the blood moon passed in a haze of questions I couldn't answer, and work that felt familiar despite the gap in my memory. My hands knew how to mend nets, my body understood the Gulf Wraith's rhythms, but when I tried to remember my first day aboard this boat, I found only empty space where those memories should have been. The absence felt like a missing tooth, something I kept probing with my tongue, unable to leave it alone. Vera watched me struggle with the gentleness of someone who'd seen this before. During the morning coffee ritual that had become our routine, she'd pull out photographs from a shoebox kept in the wheelhouse, pictures of me during those first weeks I could no longer recall. There I was, learning to coil rope, looking skeptical as she explained the rules, standing beside her as we served fuel to fishermen whose names I still remembered. "You adapted fast," she said, studying a photo of me checking the radio equipment with the focused attention of someone who understood its importance. Like my Mateo, he had that same look when he was learning something that mattered. The photos proved I'd been here, but they felt like documentation of someone else's life. I could see the progression from wariness to acceptance in my own face, watch myself becoming part of something larger than individual survival. But the emotional weight of those moments, the memories that should have given them meaning, belonged to the Tide Eater now. "Why that memory specifically?" I asked, running my fingers along the edge of a photograph that showed me standing with Vera at sunset, both of us looking toward the Gulf with expressions that suggested we were discussing something serious. "Because it was the moment you chose to stay," Vera said, her weathered hands steady on her coffee cup. "Most people who find this boat leave within a week. You decided to become part of its protection instead of just passing through. That choice was valuable enough to satisfy what took it." The work continued despite the gaps in my knowledge. My hands remembered tasks my mind couldn't place, and gradually I began to feel less like an actor playing a role and more like someone rebuilding himself from fragments. The Gulf helped. Its rhythms were constant, demanding attention that left little room for dwelling on what was missing. That's when Isla Santos came back into my life, though for me it was the first time we'd met. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 6th week, stepping onto the Gulf Wraith with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been visiting this boat her entire life. Mid-20s, with her grandmother's sharp eyes and dark hair that caught the morning light like spun copper. She wore scrubs under a light jacket, a nurse coming off the night shift, I learned later, and carried a small canvas bag that clinked softly when she moved. "Hello, Caleb," she said, her voice carrying warmth that suggested we knew each other well. "How are you feeling?" Vera told me about the memory trade. I studied her face, searching for recognition that didn't come. Pretty, obviously kind, with the kind of smile that made you want to trust her immediately. But whatever connection we'd had existed in the memory space the Tide Eater had claimed. "I'm sorry," I said, hating how the words felt on my tongue. "I don't remember you." Something flickered across her expression. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment, but she recovered quickly. "That's okay. We walked the shore a few times, talked about Lily. You showed me photos of her, told me about Tampa and how much you missed being a proper father." The mention of my daughter sent a spike of recognition through me. That bond remained intact, protected by some instinct deeper than the memories I'd traded away. Whatever the Tide Eater had taken, it hadn't touched my connection to Lily. I started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the question. "Dating might be too strong a word," Isla said, pulling shells from her canvas bag and arranging them on the boat's rail with careful precision. "Getting to know each other. You were still figuring out who you wanted to be now that you'd stopped running." She continued working while she talked, placing each shell with the deliberate care of ritual. The shells were beautiful, perfect spirals and smooth curves that caught the light like polished bone, but their arrangement felt purposeful, significant in ways I was still learning to recognize. "For Elias Cole," she explained when she noticed me watching, "the drowned rider. These mark his passage, let him know someone remembers what he was before he became what he is now. Even the dead deserve that kind of respect." It was exactly the sort of gesture that would have impressed me, I realized. Practical compassion for something most people would dismiss as superstition. The kind of woman who could accept the supernatural realities of the Gulf Coast while maintaining her own humanity. The federal investigation arrived that afternoon like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. Agent Maria Holt was everything I'd learned to be wary of during my smuggling years. Crisp suit, sharp eyes, the kind of professional competence that could unravel carefully constructed lies with surgical precision. She arrived with 2 junior agents and a file thick enough to suggest they'd been investigating Gulf Coast disappearances for months. "Mr. Reed," she said, showing her credentials with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. "I understand you work nights on this vessel. We're investigating several missing persons reports, tourists who were last seen in this area." Vera emerged from the wheelhouse before I could respond, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who'd been expecting this conversation. "Agents, what can we do for you?" "We're looking into the disappearance of Emma Lyle, a tourist from Ohio who rented a boat 3 weeks ago." Agent Holt continued, consulting her notes. "Her vessel was found empty, drifting about 2 miles from this dock. No distress signal, no signs of struggle." The name triggered something, not a full memory, but an echo of recognition. Emma Lyle. Blonde, mid-30s, wearing expensive gear that marked her as someone who'd bought her way into Gulf Coast fishing without understanding its dangers. I could see her face clearly, remember the way she'd asked questions about the deeper channels where the big fish ran. "I remember her," I said carefully. "She bought fuel here, asked about fishing spots, seemed inexperienced but determined." "When was this?" Agent Holt's pen was already moving across her notepad. 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. Late evening, around the time the commercial fishermen head out." I paused, choosing my words carefully. She was asking about areas that even experienced locals avoid. I told her to stay close to shore. "They're close to the shadow tides," Vera said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what we were dealing with. Agent Holt looked up sharply. "Shadow tides?" "Local phenomenon. Vera said with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned to explain the inexplicable to skeptical outsiders. Unusual current patterns that can be dangerous for inexperienced boaters. We always recommend staying in the marked channels. That evening, after the agents had taken their statements and departed with promises to return, Vera led me to a part of the Gulf Wraith I'd never seen before, a cabin hidden behind the engine compartment, accessible only through a hatch disguised as part of the boat's original structure. The space was cramped and humid, lined with mirrors that reflected our movements in angles that hurt to look at directly. But it was the ledger that caught my attention. A handwritten record spanning decades, listing names, dates, and circumstances of disappearance. The Gulf Wraith isn't just a fishing boat, Vera said, opening the ledger to pages yellow with age. It's an anchor point. Shadow tides are supernatural currents that flow between this world and whatever lies beneath. Without something to hold them stable, they'd sweep away everything in their path. I studied the entries, recognizing some of the names from Coast Guard reports and local newspaper stories. Emma Lyle was there, along with dozens of others stretching back to the 1980s. Each entry was methodical, clinical. Name, age, last known location, phase of the moon, notes about supernatural activity in the area. Every person lost to the shadow tides strengthens them, Vera continued, adjusting one of the mirrors so I could see the water beyond the cabin windows. That's why the rules exist. To protect people who don't understand what they're dealing with, to maintain the balance that keeps worse things from coming through. As she spoke, the radio crackled to life with static that formed patterns too regular to be random. In the mirrors, I could see figures moving beneath the water's surface, shapes that might have been human once, reaching upward with desperate gestures that would never breach the boundary between worlds. Someone has to watch, Vera said simply. Someone has to maintain the rules, help the living avoid the fate of the dead, keep the anchor point stable. It's not a job you can quit, and it's not something you can do halfway. The epilogue of my old life came a week later, when the shadow tide took the tourist skiff. Isla and I were rebuilding something that felt like friendship, carefully constructing a relationship from fragments and possibilities rather than shared memories. She'd been patient with my gaps, filling in details about conversations we'd had and places we'd walked together along the Gulf Coast beaches. "You told me you wanted to be the kind of father Lily could be proud of," she said as we watched the sunset paint the water in shades of copper and gold. "Someone who protected things instead of just taking them." It was exactly the kind of man I wanted to become, I realized. Someone who stood guard instead of looking for angles, who built something worthwhile instead of tearing it down for profit. The smuggler who'd betrayed his crew in Miami felt like someone I'd known in another lifetime, a cautionary tale about choices that led nowhere good. The skiff appeared just as full darkness settled over the Gulf, a small pleasure craft with running lights that flickered uncertainly in the gathering fog. Through the binoculars, I could see two figures aboard. Tourists, from their posture and the expensive gear visible on deck. Then the water around them began to move wrong. It started as ripples that ran counter to the wind, circles that expanded outward from no visible source. The skiff's engine coughed and died, leaving them drifting in water that reflected stars despite the cloudy sky above. One of the figures stood up, pointing toward shore with movements that seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. "Shadow tide," Vera said quietly, appearing beside me with the ledger already open to a fresh page. "They're being pulled into the current." I raised the camera she'd taught me to trust, snapping photos that would show what our eyes couldn't see. The developed images revealed the truth. Tendrils of liquid shadow rising from depths no chart had ever mapped, wrapping around the skiff's hull with the patient hunger of something that had waited a very long time to feed. By the time the Coast Guard arrived to investigate the abandoned vessel, there was nothing left but an empty boat and the kind of questions that had no answers acceptable to federal investigators. "The drowned rider's light cut the fog," I wrote in the ledger that night, documenting the encounter with the methodical precision Vera had taught me. Two souls taken to whatever depth calls them home. The anchor holds. Someone stands watch. I closed the ledger and settled into the mirror cabin, accepting the weight of guardianship that had chosen me as surely as I'd chosen it. Outside, the Gulf lapped against our hull with the gentle persistence of something vast and patient, carrying voices that would never be heard and debts that would never be paid. The drowned rider's light appeared on schedule, moving across the water with its eternal search for something that would never be found. I acknowledged it with the deck lights, maintaining the truce that kept worse things at bay, and settled in for another night of watching over waters where the living and the dead shared the same dark currents.